Long before the age of reason, in a land wrapped in gold and silence, a child was born beneath the branches of a sacred sal tree. The air was thick with fragrance, and the night itself seemed to hold its breath. It was said that his mother, Queen Maya, dreamed of a radiant white elephant descending from the heavens, its tusks glowing, its steps like thunder. When she awoke, her heart was calm and full of knowing. Something had changed. The wise men whispered that the dream foretold the coming of a great soul, one who would either rule the world or renounce it. And so, under the pale light of dawn in the gardens of Lumbini, she gave birth standing upright, grasping the branch of the tree as if to anchor herself between heaven and earth. The moment the child emerged, a breeze stirred through the blossoms. The petals fell not in sorrow, but in celebration. The newborn took 7 steps on his own, and legend says declared, "I am the chief of the world. This is my last birth." The heavens rejoiced. The earth trembled softly. And yet, amid the divine omens and celestial songs, his mother would soon die, 7 days later, leaving the infant in the care of his father, King Suddhodana, ruler of the Shakya clan. The child was named Siddhartha, meaning he who achieves his aim. But no one could have foreseen that his aim would not be a crown nor a kingdom, but something far greater. Freedom from the endless wheel of suffering. The prophecy. When the astrologers came to the palace, their faces glowed with awe and fear. They spoke in riddles and symbols, their voices trembling with reverence. "O king," they said, "your son is no ordinary child. He will either conquer the world as a mighty ruler, or leave it behind to conquer himself." The king smiled at the first part and ignored the second. He wanted a ruler, not a renunciate. He vowed to protect the boy from anything that might turn his thoughts towards sorrow, loss, or death. No sickness, no old age, no suffering was to be seen within the palace walls. Siddhartha would grow up surrounded by beauty and pleasure, every desire met, every pain hidden. The king believed that if the prince never saw the world's imperfections, he would never question it. And for a while, it worked. The palace of illusions, Siddhartha's childhood was a dream woven in silk. The palace floors shone like mirrors, the gardens overflowed with flowers that never wilted, and music filled every hour of his day. He was surrounded by teachers, dancers, and scholars. His hands learned the arts of war and peace. His mind absorbed every scripture, every science. He was gifted beyond measure, strong, graceful, serene. When he walked through the courtyards, people lowered their eyes, not out of fear, but out of reverence. He married young to Princess Yasodhara, a woman of extraordinary grace. Their love was gentle, sincere, a union of 2 hearts sheltered from the world's shadow. To Siddhartha, life seemed perfect, and yet sometimes in the quiet of dawn, when the palace still slept, he would look toward the horizon beyond the high walls and wonder what lay there. A restlessness stirred in him like wind before a storm. The dream of stillness. The king sensed this unease and ordered new delights for his son. More music, more dancers, more gardens, more games. Anything to keep his mind from drifting beyond the palace gates. But desire cannot cure disquiet. The more Siddhartha was given, the less he felt fulfilled. One evening, he watched the reflection of the moon ripple across a pond. For a moment, it seemed to break apart, shattered by the movement of water, and he realized how fragile perfection truly was. He began to sense a truth he could not yet name, that all things, beauty, youth, love, were impermanent. He asked himself, if everything I love fades, what is it that does not? That question, like a seed, was planted deep in his heart. It would grow silently, patiently, waiting for the day it would bloom into enlightenment. The seer's warning. When Siddhartha was a young man, his father invited a wandering sage named Asita to bless the boy. The old man's hair was white as snow, his eyes clear as still water. He gazed upon Siddhartha and smiled with tears in his eyes. He saw the mark of destiny upon the child's brow. "This one will awaken," he whispered. "He will become a Buddha, a perfectly enlightened being. The world will remember his name long after kings and empires have turned to dust." The king's heart clenched in fear. He could not bear the thought of losing his son to such a path. He redoubled his efforts to protect the boy from the sight of pain or age or death. The palace gates were sealed. The sick and the poor were forbidden to enter. The prince would live in paradise, safe, content, blind, the unseen world. But walls, no matter how high, cannot hold back truth forever. Beyond the palace gates lay a world of toil and tears, where men bent beneath the sun, where children cried from hunger, where the old waited for death in silence. And sooner or later, Siddhartha would see it. For now he remained in his golden cage, surrounded by beauty and ignorance, unaware that the very perfection of his life was the first illusion he would have to break. He did not yet know that enlightenment begins not in peace, but in disturbance. And soon a journey would begin that would take him through the full circle of human existence, from the heights of desire to the depths of suffering, and finally into the stillness beyond both. The truth waits for no man, the sages say. When the heart is ready, the world will reveal its cracks. And far beyond the palace walls, the cracks were already forming. A horse would be saddled. A gate would open, and the prince, who would not be king, would soon ride out to meet the world for the first time. Before the first cracks appeared, the palace of Kapilavastu still glittered with its illusion of eternity. The young Prince Siddhartha lived as if the world beyond its walls did not exist. His father, King Suddhodana, had turned the palace into a cage of beauty, walls painted with spring, gardens that never knew decay, musicians whose songs drowned out silence itself. And for a time, it worked. The prince smiled often, walked in harmony with the courtiers, studied archery and philosophy, and moved through every room like a golden thread in a tapestry of perfection. But within him, something was stirring, a quiet, questioning pulse. He would wake before dawn, long before the others, and walk among the gardens when the dew still clung to the petals. In those silent hours, he would feel something ancient pressing at the edge of his thoughts. Is this all that life can be? The breeze that touched his face was gentle, but beneath it he sensed movement, change, impermanence. Even in the perfect stillness of the palace, time was breathing. The restless heart Siddhartha had everything a man could desire: wealth, youth, power, and love. And yet, desire itself began to lose its flavor. He loved Yasodhara, his wife, deeply. She was wise and tender, her laughter soft as water. Together, they moved through the palace as if they were living in a poem. But sometimes, when she fell asleep beside him, Siddhartha would stay awake, staring at the ceiling, his heart heavy with something he could not name. He wondered why joy always seemed to fade, why every laughter was followed by a strange silence, why the scent of flowers always carried the promise of wilting. When he spoke of these thoughts to his father, the king dismissed them with a smile. "You think too much, my son. Life is meant to be lived, not questioned. Look at all you have. Be content." But contentment, Siddhartha thought, is not the same as truth. He was haunted by the feeling that the world he knew was not real, not false, but incomplete, like a story missing its final page. The curtain of beauty. The king, fearing the spark of curiosity, built higher walls and greater pleasures. He ordered 3 palaces for his son, one for the winter, one for the summer, and one for the rainy season. He filled them with dancers, musicians, and servants whose only duty was to keep the prince entertained. He even decreed that no old, sick, or poor person should ever appear before Siddhartha's eyes. Only youth and beauty were allowed within the walls. The world was reshaped to preserve a lie, and for many years the prince believed it. But no illusion lasts forever. One day, while walking through a corridor lined with mirrors, Siddhartha paused. The mirrors reflected his image endlessly, 1,000 versions of himself stretching into infinity. He suddenly wondered, if I am reflected in so many ways, which one is truly me? The thought unsettled him. For the first time, he felt trapped, not by walls, but by appearances. The king's fear. The king began to worry. He could see the shadow in his son's eyes, the distant look that wandered beyond the horizon. When court astrologers reminded him of the prophecy that his son might leave the world behind to become a teacher, Suddhodana's fear deepened. He ordered festivals, hunting trips, tournaments, everything that might distract the prince. He told Yasodhara to keep him close, to fill his heart with affection. But love, too, cannot hold what is destined to go. One night, Siddhartha spoke softly to Yasodhara as they stood on the balcony, watching the moon rise above the palace gardens. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "what lies beyond those hills? What happens to the people we do not see?" She looked at him with sadness. "The world is full of sorrow," she said. "Your father hides it from you for love, but someday you will see it." Her words lingered like an echo. He could not sleep that night. The child. Soon after, a son was born to them, a child named Rahula, the fetter. The name itself was an omen, a symbol of attachment and responsibility. When the servants brought the news, the court rejoiced, but Siddhartha's heart trembled. He held the infant in his arms, overwhelmed by love and fear. The baby's tiny fingers grasped his own as if to say, "Stay." But deep inside, a voice whispered, "This, too, is impermanent." He saw in the fragile beauty of his child the reflection of all suffering, the fear of loss, the inevitability of change. As Yasodhara slept, he whispered to his newborn son, "You are my joy, but you are also my chain." That night, while the palace celebrated, Siddhartha walked to the edge of the terrace and looked toward the dark mountains. Somewhere beyond them, he knew, was the truth he had been denied. The dream. Soon after Rahula's birth, Siddhartha had a dream. He saw 4 men walking down a long road, one old, one sick, one dead, and one dressed in robes radiant with peace. He woke, trembling. The dream haunted him for days, like a memory of something he had not yet lived. He told no one, but the seed of curiosity became unbearable. Finally, one morning, he told his charioteer, Channa, that he wished to see the city beyond the walls. The king hesitated, but dared not refuse. He ordered the streets to be cleared of anything unpleasant. No beggars, no old men, no signs of decay. The illusion would hold, he thought. He was wrong. The first cracks. As Siddhartha's chariot passed through the city gates, he looked around with the wonder of a child seeing the world for the first time. The colors, the sounds, the faces. It was all alive. And then he saw him. An old man, bent and trembling, his skin folded like dry leaves, his eyes dim with the weight of years. Siddhartha froze. "What is wrong with him?" he asked. Channa hesitated. "He is old, my lord." "All men grow old." "All?" "Yes, my lord. You too. And I." The words struck like thunder. Siddhartha's perfect world began to crumble. He returned to the palace, silent and pale. The dances, the feasts, the music, all seemed hollow now, shadows of joy against a backdrop of inevitable decay. The kingdom of shadows. From that day, nothing felt the same. Every sound seemed distant, every pleasure empty. The laughter in the halls echoed like ghosts. Siddhartha began to see the palace for what it truly was, not a paradise, but a prison built out of fear. And soon, fate would lead him beyond its walls again, 3 more times, to witness sickness, death, and the path of renunciation. Each sight would shatter another layer of illusion, until nothing remained but the truth itself. Ignorance is the root of suffering, he would one day teach, and the first step toward awakening is to open your eyes. The eyes of Siddhartha Gautama were opening, and what they saw would change the world forever. The night air in Kapilavastu was cool and heavy with jasmine when Prince Siddhartha awoke from another restless dream. The walls that had once made him feel safe now seemed to close in around him, like hands keeping him blind. The sound of flutes and laughter still drifted from the distant halls, but to him it all felt hollow, like music played for a man already gone. He could no longer bear the golden silence of ignorance. He needed to know what lay beyond the palace, beyond illusion. And so, one morning, against his father's wishes, Siddhartha summoned his faithful charioteer Channa and ordered the royal horses prepared. "Today," he said quietly, "we ride into the city." The king tried to stop him, but the desire for truth is stronger than any law, and truth at last was waiting for him on 4 roads in 4 faces, each one revealing the world as it truly is. The first sight, the old man. The chariot rolled through the gates at sunrise. The city of Kapilavastu stirred awake. Merchants shouted, mothers carried water, children laughed in the dust. For a brief moment, Siddhartha smiled. The world seemed vibrant, alive. Then, suddenly, his smile faded. On the side of the road, leaning on a stick, walked an old man. His back was bent, his hair white, his hands trembling. His skin hung loose upon his bones, and every breath came with effort. Siddhartha turned to Channa, his voice trembling. "What is wrong with that man?" Channa hesitated but could not lie. "He is old, my lord. His youth is gone. Time changes us all." Siddhartha frowned. "All men grow like this?" "Yes, my lord. It happens to everyone, if they live long enough." The prince fell silent. The wheels of the chariot kept turning, but inside him something stopped. For the first time, he felt time itself. He looked down at his own hands, smooth and young, and imagined them trembling and wrinkled like the old man's. The perfection of his world cracked. He realized that the beauty he had clung to was already dying, moment by moment. The second sight. The sick man. Days later, Siddhartha went out again. The king, frightened by his son's questions, had ordered the streets to be cleared of the sick and poor, but truth has a way of slipping through even the tightest defenses. As the chariot passed through the narrow streets, Siddhartha saw a man lying in the dust. His face was pale, his body twisted with pain. He coughed and shivered, unable to stand. Siddhartha stepped down from the chariot and knelt beside him. "What ails this man?" he asked. Channa bowed his head. "He is sick, my lord. The body weakens. Disease strikes all creatures." The prince touched the man's forehead, feeling the heat of fever. He looked around and saw others with tired faces, coughing, limping, suffering quietly as life went on around them. "Can this happen to me?" he whispered. "It can happen to anyone," said Channa. Siddhartha stood and felt his stomach turn. He had been surrounded by health and strength his whole life, and now he realized they were fragile illusions, flowers blooming on the edge of decay. If sickness could strike anyone, then what safety was there in beauty? What peace in power? The third sight. The corpse. Not long after, the prince rode out a third time. The sun was setting, and a strange stillness lay over the road. Ahead, a crowd had gathered, carrying a body wrapped in white cloth. Siddhartha asked what they were doing. "It is a funeral, my lord," said Channa. "The man is dead." "Dead?" "Yes. His breath has left him. His heart no longer beats. All that he was is gone. Siddhartha's face went pale. Will this happen to me? To my father? My wife? My son? Channa nodded sadly. It comes for all, my lord. No one escapes. Siddhartha stared at the still form being carried to the pyre, the air thick with the scent of smoke and grief. He felt a great wave of fear and sorrow rising in him. Everything he loved, his family, his youth, his kingdom, would one day vanish. The laughter in the palace, the gardens, the songs, all would be swallowed by this same silence. He whispered, almost to himself, "So this is life, a march toward death." That night, he could not eat. He could not speak. He sat by his window, watching the moon drift through the clouds, and wondered how men could live, knowing everything they loved would end. The fourth sight, the wandering monk. The next morning, he rode out again, against his father's pleas, against his own fear. He had to know if there was anything beyond suffering. On the road, he saw a man dressed in simple robes, his head shaved, his eyes calm as still water. The monk walked barefoot, carrying a bowl, begging not out of shame, but out of peace. Siddhartha felt drawn to him, as though he had known him forever. He stopped the chariot and stepped closer. "Who is this man?" "A mendicant," said Channa. "He has renounced the world. He seeks truth." "He owns nothing?" "Nothing, my lord. And yet he looks free." The monk turned his gaze to Siddhartha, smiled gently and bowed. In that silent moment, Siddhartha saw something he had never seen before. Not joy, not pleasure, but peace. The monk's serenity was like cool rain after a lifetime of thirst. As they rode back to the palace, Siddhartha said softly, "I have seen old age. I have seen sickness. I have seen death, and now I have seen the path that escapes them all. The seed of awakening." That night, Siddhartha sat alone, surrounded by everything a man could desire, yet feeling emptier than ever. The laughter of the palace sounded distant, almost cruel. He understood now that no pleasure could protect him from suffering, no wealth could buy freedom from decay. He saw that all things rise and fall, live and die, bloom and wither. And yet, the image of the wandering monk lingered in his mind, a man untouched by fear, unbroken by loss. There, in the flickering light of a single oil lamp, Siddhartha made his first vow. "I will not rest until I find what that man has found. I will seek the end of suffering, even if I must give up everything to do so." The path ahead was invisible, the price unimaginable. But destiny had already taken its first breath, the quiet before the departure. The next morning, the king noticed the change in his son. Siddhartha spoke little, his eyes far away. No music, no feast, no celebration could draw him back. He was no longer the prince of pleasures. He was the man who had seen the truth, and truth once seen cannot be unseen. The palace was now a gilded cage, the crown a chain. He waited only for the right night, the right silence, to begin his journey. The prince, who had everything, was about to leave it all behind, not out of rebellion, but out of love for the world's suffering hearts. To see the world as it is, he would one day teach, is the beginning of compassion. Siddhartha had seen it, and the world he once knew had vanished. Soon he would follow the path of the monk in his vision. He would ride into the darkness, alone, searching for the light that no death could touch. The night the prince left his palace was a night so still that even the stars seemed to hold their breath. In the moonlight, Kapilavastu slept, guards leaning against spears, servants dreaming in their chambers, musicians' instruments silent in the corridors of gold. And deep inside that stillness, Siddhartha Gautama, son of King Suddhodana and Queen Maya, sat awake beside the bed of his sleeping wife, Yasodhara, and their newborn son, Rahula. The oil lamp flickered, casting shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to move like memories. He looked at them both, mother and child, with a love so deep that it hurt. He reached out a hand to touch his son's tiny fingers, but stopped midway. If he touched the child, he thought, the weight of that love might break his resolve. If he stayed one more night, he might never leave. And yet somewhere beyond the walls of the palace, beyond comfort and joy and illusion, truth was calling him. A voice too old to ignore, too sacred to silence. The final vision. He stood, wrapped in silence, and walked through the palace corridors one last time. He passed the dancers' hall, now dark and empty. The same dancers who had once moved like rivers of grace now lay asleep, their painted faces smudged, their hair undone, their beauty stripped of its illusion. For the first time, Siddhartha saw them as they were, human, fragile, transient. The palace that had once glittered with perfection now appeared to him like a golden prison. Every wall, every jewel, every fragrance seemed to whisper of impermanence. He realized that the entire world, not just his palace, was built on this same illusion, the desperate attempt to make the temporary feel eternal. He turned away from the silk and gold, and for the first time, he felt something he had never known: freedom from desire. The farewell outside in the courtyard, Channa, his loyal charioteer, waited with his horse, Kanthaka, who pawed the earth nervously. The moonlight traced their outlines like silver. Siddhartha approached quietly. Channa looked up and saw the face of a man transformed, serene, resolute, radiant with a calm that both comforted and terrified him. "My lord," whispered Channa, "why do we leave at this hour? The world sleeps." "The world always sleeps," Siddhartha replied softly, "and I must awaken." They rode out through the gates, the city silent beneath them. The guards, as if moved by unseen will, looked away. Even the dogs did not bark. As the palace receded into the darkness, Siddhartha did not look back. Behind him was everything a man could cling to: family, wealth, power. Ahead of him was nothing but the unknown, and yet, for the first time, his heart felt light. The crossing. They rode until the first light of dawn brushed the horizon. At the banks of the river Anoma, Siddhartha dismounted. He looked toward the far shore, a thin line of mist over still water. It was the border between the life he had known and the life he would choose. He handed Channa his royal ornaments, his sword, his jeweled earrings. He removed his silken robes and folded them neatly, leaving only a simple cloth around his body. "Take these back to my father," he said. "Tell him his son seeks not wealth but peace. Tell him I go to find the way that ends all sorrow." Channa's eyes filled with tears. "Without you there is no meaning in this service, my lord." Siddhartha smiled, a small, compassionate smile. "Then serve truth. That is the highest loyalty." He cut his hair with his own sword and let the strands fall into the river. The water carried them away like fragments of another life. And in that moment, Prince Siddhartha died, and the Seeker was born. The Wanderer. He crossed the river barefoot. The earth was cold, the grass wet with dew. Each step felt like a vow. As he reached the far bank, he felt the weight of the world lift from him. No more guards, no more servants, no more duties. He was alone, but not lonely. He looked up at the rising sun and whispered, "Let me see truth as it is, not as I wish it to be." He wandered for days, begging for food, sleeping beneath trees, speaking to anyone who might know the path to liberation. His royal skin burned under the sun, his feet blistered on the earth. But he did not falter. In every face he saw beggar, farmer, widow, child. He saw the same question he carried: why do we suffer? The meeting with the hermits. Eventually, Siddhartha came upon a forest where holy men lived, ascetics who sought freedom through denial. They lived on roots and water. their bones sharp under thin skin, their eyes blazing with discipline. They welcomed him, impressed by his quiet dignity. He told them his story, and they recognized in him not arrogance, but sincerity. "You seek truth," said one of the elder ascetics, "then strip away all that binds you to the world. Desire is the chain. Break it, and you shall be free." Siddhartha joined them, and together they practiced severe austerities. They fasted for days, meditated under the blazing sun, and tried to silence every craving. But as the months turned into years, Siddhartha's body grew frail, his skin clinging to bone. His mind became sharp, but his heart felt heavy. He began to realize that this too was an illusion, that suffering was not conquered by fleeing it, nor by torturing the body, but by understanding it. He began to see that extreme pleasure and extreme pain were two sides of the same chain. He needed a middle way. The Great Awakening begins. One evening, as the sun sank into gold and crimson, Siddhartha walked away from the hermits. They called after him in anger, thinking he had given up the path. But he was not giving up, he was beginning it. He walked to a river and bathed, letting the cool water cleanse the dust of false paths. There, a young woman named Sujata saw him and offered him a bowl of rice milk, the first food he had eaten in days. He accepted it with gratitude. In that simple act of nourishment, he understood something profound. Balance, not denial, leads to truth. He sat beneath a great Bodhi tree, resolved that he would not rise until he understood the nature of all things. The wind whispered through the leaves like the breath of eternity. He closed his eyes. The final battle, not with the world, but within himself, had begun. "The truth is not found in the palace or in the forest," he would one day say. "It is found in the quiet center where desire and denial fall silent." Siddhartha Gautama had crossed every border that the world could draw. Now he would cross the one between ignorance and awakening. The forest did not welcome him, nor did it reject him. It simply was. Its stillness was the stillness of eternity, its sounds the breathing of the earth. Here, in this vast silence, Siddhartha Gautama began the most difficult journey a man can take, not across land or sea, but through the endless corridors of his own mind. He had left behind a kingdom, a wife, a child, and every comfort known to man. Now, he had nothing, no crown, no name, no certainty, only a single question that followed him through every sunrise and every sleepless night. What is the nature of suffering, and how can it end? The ascetics. For years, Siddhartha wandered among the forests and mountains of northern India, living alongside hermits and ascetics who believed the body was the enemy of the soul. They taught that freedom could be won only through renunciation, by denying every pleasure, every need, every comfort. He listened, learned, and followed their path with unshakable resolve. He ate little, sometimes a single grain of rice a day. He meditated for hours under the scorching sun, his body trembling, his breath shallow. He allowed the rain to soak him, the insects to bite him, the wind to tear at his skin. His ribs became visible, his face hollow, his limbs weak. The men around him looked at him with awe and fear. His discipline was so absolute that they began to whisper he might already be holy. But inside, Siddhartha felt no peace. He had tamed the body, but the mind still stirred like a storm. The hunger remained, not for food, but for truth. The illusion of extremes. One morning, after fainting from exhaustion near the river, he opened his eyes and saw the reflection of his own face in the water. He saw not a sage, but a skeleton of suffering, a man dying for a truth he had not yet found. He realized that this too was a form of desire, the desire to escape life rather than understand it. He saw that both luxury and asceticism were cages built of extremes, each trapping the soul in illusion. In that moment, clarity dawned, like the first light after endless darkness. If you tighten a string too much, he remembered an old musician saying, it will snap. If you loosen it too much, it will not play. Truth, he saw, was like that string. It could not be found in indulgence or denial, but in balance, the path between. He called it the middle way. Sujata's gift. That evening, as he sat weak and trembling beneath a banyan tree, a young village girl named Sujata saw him and mistook him for a forest spirit. Moved by compassion, she offered him a bowl of rice milk, soft, warm, simple. At first, Siddhartha hesitated. To eat would be to abandon the discipline he had built for years. But then he understood. This was not weakness, it was wisdom. He accepted the bowl with a gentle nod and drank. With each mouthful, his body returned to life. He felt strength, not of indulgence, but of balance. Neither craving nor rejecting, simply being. The ascetics, who had once admired him, saw this act and turned away in disgust. They called him a failure, a man who had surrendered to temptation. But Siddhartha knew differently. He had discovered that truth does not require destruction, it requires clarity. The still point. After Sujata's gift, he washed his face in the river and gazed into the flowing water. For the first time, he did not see the reflection of a prince or a beggar or an ascetic. He saw only a man, human, mortal, but capable of awakening. He felt the river's rhythm echo within him, the endless cycle of birth and death, change and renewal. He realized that all things flowed together, pain and joy, love and loss, life and death. As the river flows, he whispered, so does all existence. He felt an immense peace rising within him, not from knowledge, but from understanding. The Bodhi tree days later, he came to a great fig tree, later to be called the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening. He spread a small mat of grass at its roots and sat down cross-legged, his face calm, his eyes half closed. The wind rustled the leaves like distant whispers. The world fell silent around him. He made a vow. Let my body wither and my bones turn to dust. I will not rise from this seat until I have found what I seek, the end of suffering. Night descended, and with it came the final test. The temptation of Mara. As Siddhartha entered the deepest meditation, Mara, the Lord of Illusion, appeared, a being born from desire and fear, whose power lay in the mind itself. Mara conjured visions before him, his palace gleaming and golden, his wife calling softly, his infant son reaching out for him, riches, power, pleasure, every dream he had left behind. Siddhartha felt the old ache of attachment tug at his heart, but he breathed it away. He saw these things for what they were, shadows of longing, not reality. Mara grew furious. He sent armies of demons, storms of fire, torrents of fear. Siddhartha did not move. The earth itself bore witness to his stillness. Finally, Mara whispered the last temptation. Who are you to claim enlightenment? Who are you to challenge the world? Siddhartha opened his eyes, calm and vast as the sky. He reached down and touched the earth with his right hand. The earth is my witness, he said. At that touch, Mara vanished. The winds stilled, the darkness lifted, and within that stillness, Siddhartha's mind became clear as a polished mirror. The dawn. As the morning star rose above the horizon, Siddhartha Gautama saw the world as it truly was, not in fragments, but as one eternal flow. He saw birth and death, joy and sorrow, rising and falling like the tides. He saw that everything was connected, everything impermanent, and that clinging to what changes is the root of all suffering. He understood that freedom lay not in escaping the world, but in understanding it, accepting all that arises and passes away with equal compassion. He had found the answer that no palace or penance could reveal, When he opened his eyes, the darkness of ignorance had vanished. The man who had sought truth was gone. In his place sat the awakened one, the Buddha. "Through countless births I have wandered," he would later say, "seeking but never finding the builder of this house. Now I have seen him. This house will not be built again." Siddhartha Gautama had conquered the only enemy that matters, ignorance. And from that moment, the light of awakening began to spread through the world. For 7 days and 7 nights, Siddhartha Gautama sat beneath the great Bodhi tree, unmoving, untouched by hunger or sleep. The forest watched him in silence. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The man who had left behind a kingdom and conquered himself was now the Buddha, the awakened one. But awakening is not a moment of thunder. It is a dawn so still that only the heart can hear it. When his eyes opened on that final morning, he did not see the world changed. He saw that it had never been otherwise. The dewdrops glistened on the grass, the birds called from the branches, the river whispered through the reeds. Everything was exactly as before, and yet utterly new. For in that instant, he understood what had eluded kings, warriors, and scholars for centuries, the pattern beneath all things, the rhythm of the universe itself. The night of realization. During the long night of meditation, 3 great insights unfolded within him, as if veils were lifting one by one from the eyes of eternity. First, he saw his own past lives. Countless births and deaths, faces and forms, a river of existence flowing endlessly. He saw that life was not a straight line, but a circle. Birth following death, death following birth, bound by the thread of craving and ignorance. Then he saw the endless cycle of all living beings, rising, falling, wandering through the realms of existence, driven by desire and fear. He saw the laws that bind the cosmos, karma, cause and effect, the balance of every act and thought. Finally, he saw the truth that ended the circle, that suffering itself could cease when the fires of desire were extinguished. In that seeing, the wheel stopped, the house of illusion crumbled, the builder of sorrow was revealed, and the mind, at last, was free. The great discovery. When the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Siddhartha understood what all existence was built upon and how it could be transformed. He saw that life is suffering because everything we cling to is impermanent. He saw that suffering has a cause, desire, the endless craving for what cannot last. He saw that suffering can end when desire is let go. And he saw that there is a path, a way to live that leads to peace, compassion, and wisdom. These became known as the 4 Noble Truths, the foundation of all that the Buddha would teach. The truth of suffering, dukkha. To live is to experience loss, pain, impermanence. The truth of the cause, samudaya. The cause of suffering is craving, our endless thirst for what we cannot hold. The truth of the end, nirodha. When craving ceases, peace begins. The truth of the path, magga. There is a way to end suffering, the Noble Eightfold Path, a life of right understanding, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. These truths were not beliefs, they were discoveries seen directly in the stillness of awakening. The Buddha realized that every creature carries within it the same potential for enlightenment, that each mind is a seed waiting to bloom in understanding. The middle way. In that quiet dawn, he remembered all he had seen, the palace and its pleasures, the forest and its torments. Both had been cages. Pleasure binds the body, pain binds the mind. Freedom lies not in extremes, but in the balance between them. He called it the middle way, a path neither of indulgence nor denial, but of harmony with the truth of things. It was simple, yet revolutionary, to see clearly, to act with compassion, to live without attachment. And in that simplicity lay a power greater than all kingdoms, the temptation of doubt. As he sat in the stillness of realization, Mara, the spirit of illusion, returned, not in fire and thunder this time, but in the soft voice of doubt. "You are enlightened," Mara whispered, "but who will understand you? The world is blind, lost in desire. Your truth will be wasted on them." For a moment, the Buddha hesitated. He saw the endless suffering of mankind, people chasing joy and finding pain, clinging to life and fearing death. He knew the truth was subtle, fragile, easily misunderstood. How could he make them see what cannot be seen? How could words capture the silence he had found? And yet compassion stirred in him, vast, boundless, irresistible. He remembered the faces of those he had met along his path, the old man, the sick man, the corpse, the monk. He remembered his wife and son, the father who loved him, the people lost in their own illusions. He could not leave them in darkness. "There are some," he said softly, "whose eyes are only lightly covered by dust. For their sake, I will teach." At that moment, Mara vanished forever. The Buddha's compassion had overcome doubt itself. The 7 weeks of stillness. After his enlightenment, the Buddha remained near the Bodhi tree for 7 weeks, moving little, meditating on the vastness of what he had seen. For 1 week, he gazed at the tree in gratitude. For another, he walked back and forth along a small path, his steps slow and mindful. For a third, he sat beneath a nearby tree, contemplating the truth of interdependence, how every breath, every leaf, every being is connected to all others. The devas, the celestial beings, descended in quiet reverence, circling him in light. Even the animals of the forest came close, sensing in him no danger, only peace. It was said that during those weeks, rain fell gently, and a great serpent coiled itself around him to shield him from the storm, as if the earth itself sought to protect its awakened child. The hesitation to teach. When the 7 weeks had passed, the Buddha rose and began to walk again. He met a traveler on the road who was struck by the radiance of his face. "Who are you?" the man asked. "Are you a god?" "No," the Buddha said. "Then what are you?" He smiled. "I am awake." The man bowed without knowing why, and so began the long journey of a teacher who never sought followers, a king who ruled no land but the heart. The Buddha set out to share the path, not as dogma, but as discovery, a way for each being to awaken in their own time. The turning of the wheel, his first steps led him to the deer park at Sarnath, where 5 ascetics, his former companions, still practiced their austerities. When they saw him approach, they whispered among themselves, "Here comes the one who failed, the one who ate." But as he drew closer, they felt their anger dissolve. Something in his presence silenced all judgment. His eyes were calm, his face radiant, his movements neither proud nor humble, simply true. He spoke to them of the middle way, of the 4 noble truths, of the path that ends suffering. And as they listened, one by one, understanding bloomed within them like lotus flowers opening to the sun. The wheel of truth, the Dharma chakra, had been set in motion. The birth of the Sangha. The 5 ascetics became his first disciples, the first monks of what would become the Sangha, the community of seekers. They walked barefoot from village to village, sharing food, teaching peace, living without possession. For the first time, the teachings of awakening spread among the people, not through conquest, but through compassion. The Buddha had given the world no religion, no creed, no commandments. He had given it a mirror and taught it how to see. "As a candle lights another," he said, "without diminishing its own flame, so does truth shared never diminish, but multiply." The prince who had left his palace had now become the light that would illuminate centuries, but his journey as a teacher had only begun. The dawn at Sarnath's deer park was a quiet one, gilded in the soft amber of early light. Dew clung to the tall grass, and a faint mist drifted above the still earth. The world seemed to wait, holding its breath. In that sacred silence, the Buddha walked slowly toward 5 men, his former companions, the ascetics who had once turned their backs on him when he abandoned the path of starvation. They had mocked him for accepting food from Sujata, believing he had betrayed the search for truth. But now, as he approached, they saw something in his face they could not name, neither pride nor shame, but a calm so vast it silenced even their thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, yet it carried like a bell through the morning mist. "Friends," he said, "the path I have found is not one of extremes, not indulgence, not denial, but the middle way, the path that leads to freedom." They listened, at first with doubt, then with stillness. For in his words they heard not theory, but truth spoken from the center of being. And so began the first teaching, the first turning of the wheel of Dharma that would set in motion a revolution of the human spirit. The wheel of truth. They gathered under the spreading trees of the park, seated upon the cool earth. The air shimmered with morning light, and even the deer drew closer, unafraid. The Buddha began to speak, not to convert, but to awaken. "All life is bound by suffering," he said, "for all things that arise will pass away. To cling to what changes is to be burned by longing, yet there is a way beyond suffering, and I will show it to you." He spoke of the 4 noble truths, not as commandments, but as discoveries, keys that open the heart to understanding. He explained the noble eightfold path, the way of clarity, compassion, and discipline, right view, seeing the world as it truly is, not through the veil of desire, right intention, the will to act with kindness and understanding, right speech, words that heal, not wound, right action, deeds that bring peace, not harm, right livelihood, work that sustains without exploiting, right effort, the steady cultivation of goodness, right mindfulness, awareness of each moment as sacred, right concentration, the stillness that reveals truth. As he spoke, his listeners felt their hearts lighten. They had starved their bodies in search of freedom, but this was different. This was a nourishment of the soul. The Buddha told them that enlightenment was not a gift from gods or spirits. It was the birthright of every being who dares to see. "Each of you," he said, "is the lamp that must light its own path. I can only show you the flame." The 5 become awakened. As the Buddha finished speaking, silence settled like golden dust over the park. The 5 ascetics, Kondana, Bhadya, Vapa, Mahanama, and Asaji, sat motionless, their minds suspended in the clarity of what they had heard. Kondana, the eldest, was the first to truly understand. A tear rolled down his cheek as he whispered, "All that arises passes away." In that moment his mind opened. The first spark of awakening lit within him. He bowed to the Buddha and said, "Blessed be the awakened one, blessed be the teaching, blessed be the community of seekers." Thus was born the Sangha, the community of monks, the first disciples of the Buddha, the living flame of truth. The wheel of Dharma had turned for the first time, and it would never stop. The spreading of the light word spread quickly across the plains of Magadha that a man had attained perfect wisdom, not through miracles or war, but through understanding. Farmers, scholars, kings, and beggars came to see him. Some came to test him, others to mock him, most to simply listen. He spoke to all as equals. He used no language of gods or punishment. He spoke of mind, of how the world we see is shaped by our thoughts, and how peace is not found in heaven, but in awareness. As a mirror reflects what is before it, he said, so the mind creates the world it sees. Change the mind, and the world changes. His teachings spread like ripples across a still pond. The Buddha's presence was quiet, but magnetic. He asked for nothing, no offerings, no obedience, no worship. He taught by example, walking barefoot from village to village, accepting food from anyone who offered it, speaking to kings and servants with the same gentle grace. The renunciation of pride. One day, King Bimbisara of Magadha invited him to his palace. The king bowed deeply before the Buddha and said, "I have conquered many lands, yet none have given me peace. Teach me what cannot be taken by death." The Buddha replied, "Rule yourself before you rule others. The greatest victory is not over kingdoms, but over the mind." The king was moved. He offered the Buddha a forest grove near the capital as a resting place for his monks. It would become the Bamboo Grove Monastery, one of the first sanctuaries of the Sangha. The Buddha accepted, not as a gift, but as an opportunity to teach the art of humility, to possess without owning, to receive without clinging. The Sermon of Compassion. In the evenings, as the sun fell behind the trees, villagers gathered around the Buddha to listen. Children sat at his feet. The old leaned close to hear his soft words. He spoke not of sin or salvation, but of compassion, the understanding that all beings suffer and that kindness is the only cure. "As a mother protects her only child," he said, "so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living things." And he taught that anger burns the one who holds it, that hatred is conquered not by more hatred, but by love. He told stories of kindness, a thief who became a saint, a murderer who found peace, a king who learned to rule with mercy. He showed that enlightenment was not escape from life, but deeper participation in it. The fragrance of truth. The Buddha's fame grew, though he cared nothing for fame. He walked barefoot through mud and dust, sleeping under trees, eating from his bowl. When asked why he did not perform miracles, he smiled and said, "The greatest miracle is to understand." And people began to see that the calm in his eyes was miracle enough. Even those who came to challenge him often left in silence, their anger dissolved. He changed not through argument but through presence, the living proof that peace is possible. The new dawn. One evening, as the Buddha and his disciples watched the moon rise over the deer park, Kondana turned to him and said, "Master, you have shown us the path. What shall we do now?" The Buddha gazed at the moon reflected in the river and said, "Walk it, for a teaching not lived is like a flower never bloomed." And so, the monks set forth across the land, carrying the words of awakening not in scrolls or doctrines, but in their hearts. They walked with no possessions, no weapons, no ambition, only peace. Wherever they went, the world grew a little quieter, a little kinder. Just as the fragrance of a lotus does not cling to the water, the Buddha said, so the fragrance of truth spreads without effort. The wheel had begun to turn, and the sound of its turning, the soft hum of compassion, would echo for centuries. Years passed. The Buddha's words spread like wind through the plains of Magadha, across forests and rivers, into kingdoms and villages where the poor worked the soil and kings wore crowns of gold. Everywhere he went, people said the same thing, that there was something different about this man, not his face, not his voice, but the stillness that surrounded him like light. He walked barefoot. He begged for his meals. He owned nothing but a robe and a bowl. And yet rulers bowed before him, and thieves laid down their weapons at his feet. The world was hungry for his teaching. But as the light of his truth grew brighter, so did the shadows it cast. The path of the teacher. The Buddha's life became a rhythm of wandering and teaching. He rose with the dawn, meditated as the birds began to sing, and walked with his monks through the villages, their bowls held humbly, their steps silent. When they reached a town, they stood quietly in a line. The villagers came forward, placing rice, fruit, and bread in their bowls. They never asked for anything, and yet they were never hungry. People said that when the Buddha accepted food, he did so as if accepting the universe itself. There was no greed, no judgment, no pride, only gratitude. When the meal was done, he would sit beneath a tree, and the people would gather. Children, merchants, soldiers, widows, kings, they all came, drawn not by promises of heaven, but by the peace in his gaze. He spoke to them of the middle way, of living without extremes. If the string of a lute is too tight, he said, it will break. If it is too loose, it will not sing. The path is balance. Neither indulgence nor denial, neither passion nor numbness, neither holding nor rejecting. The path is stillness in motion. The seeds of the Dharma, from those gatherings his followers grew. There were monks and nuns, farmers and merchants, even thieves and soldiers who laid down their arms. The Sangha, his community of seekers, became a living tapestry of all humanity. He sent them out in pairs, in all directions, with one simple instruction: go, for the good of many, out of compassion for the world. Speak not to convert, but to awaken. Offer truth as one offers water to the thirsty. And so they went, barefoot, unarmed, unafraid. They carried no scriptures, only memory. They spread not doctrine, but peace. The challenge of kings. The Buddha's teachings reached royal ears. Some kings embraced them, finding in his words a wisdom beyond power. Others saw them as dangerous, an idea that might unmake the old order. When King Pasenadi of Kosala invited the Buddha to his court, he said, "Holy One, you teach that all men are equal, that birth does not make a man noble, only his deeds. Do you not fear this will weaken kingdoms?" The Buddha replied with a smile, "A kingdom built on fear will crumble. A kingdom built on compassion will endure." Pasenadi bowed his head. In that moment, the wisdom of a mendicant humbled a throne. But others were not so gentle. Priests, jealous of their fading influence, whispered that the Buddha was a heretic. They accused him of teaching against the gods, of undermining duty and caste. To every slander, the Buddha answered only with silence, for silence, he knew, was the mirror where lies destroy themselves. The Fire Sermon. One evening, standing before hundreds gathered along the riverbank, the Buddha raised his hand and said, "Everything is burning. The eyes are burning, the ears are burning, the tongue, the mind, all burning with the fire of craving, the fire of hatred, the fire of delusion. But when one sees the fire and turns away, then the heart becomes cool." The people listened, transfixed. They felt in their own bodies the truth of his words, the fever of desire, the ache of wanting, the restlessness that never ends. And they understood that the cooling of the heart was not death, but freedom. The conversion of Angulimala. Among the stories of those years, one shone brighter than the rest. A murderer named Angulimala roamed the forests, feared by all. He had killed hundreds, stringing their fingers as trophies around his neck. One day, he saw the Buddha walking calmly down the road. He shouted, "Stop, monk!" The Buddha kept walking. "Stop!" The murderer roared again. The Buddha turned and said, "I have stopped, Angulimala. It is you who have not stopped." Something in the calmness of his voice broke the killer's rage. He fell to his knees and wept. The Buddha placed a hand upon his head and said, "Hatred never ends by hatred. It ends by love. This is an eternal law." From that day, Angulimala became a monk, living the rest of his life in peace. When people saw him begging for food, they whispered, "There walks the murderer." But the Buddha said, "There walks a man reborn." The sorrow of attachment. Not all lessons came easily. One day, a woman named Siddhartha Gautama came to the Buddha, her dead child in her arms. She fell at his feet and cried, "Master, give me medicine to bring my son back to life." The Buddha looked at her with deep compassion and said, "Bring me a mustard seed from a house that has never known death." She ran from door to door, asking, pleading. Every house gave her mustard seeds, but every family said the same. "Death has touched us too." By nightfall, she returned empty-handed, but her tears had changed. "Now I understand," she whispered. "Death is the law of all life." The Buddha took the child from her arms and said, "He is at peace now. When you understand impermanence, grief becomes compassion." And in that grief, she awakened. The storm of followers. The Sangha grew larger than anyone could have imagined. Thousands followed the Buddha, some out of faith, others out of hope, and a few out of pride. He saw among them the seeds of confusion. Some began to worship him as a god, though he denied divinity. Others argued over his teachings, seeking rules where he had spoken of freedom. He told them, "Do not follow me blindly. Be a lamp unto yourselves. Examine all things. Walk the path, not my shadow." But men are drawn to idols as moths to flame. Even the purest truth, once spoken, becomes distorted by human hands. The Buddha saw this and did not despair. He understood that every truth must first pass through misunderstanding before it finds its way home. The quiet flame. By now, decades had passed since the night of his awakening. His hair had turned silver, his body lean and frail, yet his presence was still like the heart of a mountain, silent, unshakable. He continued to walk from village to village, barefoot and smiling, a bowl in his hand and the universe in his gaze. He had become not only a teacher, but the living embodiment of peace itself. Those who met him felt it instantly, an understanding without words, a love without attachment. "My teaching," he said, "is like a raft. When you have crossed the river, do not carry it on your back. Leave it behind and continue walking." The Buddha knew that even the greatest truths are temporary. The path is not to cling to the teaching, but to awaken beyond it. The rising shadow. But the world is never still. For every person touched by wisdom, there were others threatened by it. For every heart opened, another closed tighter. Jealousy rose among the monks. Rivalries brewed. Even some of the Buddha's closest disciples struggled to understand the simplicity of his message. He saw it all with compassion, not anger. He knew that the path of awakening is not a straight line, but a spiral, the same lessons repeating until they are truly learned. Even as a candle burns itself to give light, he told them, so must truth pass through flame. The Buddha had lit that candle in the darkness of the world, and though the flame flickered, it would never die. The Buddha had never sought fame. He had walked barefoot from village to village, slept beneath trees, and eaten from a single bowl. Yet now his name traveled faster than the wind. Kings, merchants, monks, and beggars all spoke of him. To some he was a prophet, to others a heretic. To many he had become something more dangerous, a symbol. The more people tried to define him, the further they drifted from the truth he taught. The world, it seemed, was determined to turn the man who had renounced everything into an object of worship. And so began the Buddha's final struggle. Not against desire, not against ignorance, but against reverence itself. The burden of reverence. Everywhere he went now, people fell to their knees. They built temples in his honor, burned incense at his image, and called him Lord. When he entered a village, crowds pressed around him, fighting to touch the hem of his robe. The Buddha would raise his hand and say gently, "Do not worship me. Look to your own mind. That is where the Buddha dwells." But his humility only deepened their awe. Some of his disciples began to speak of him as divine, claiming that his birth was foretold by the stars, that his enlightenment was beyond human reach. He sighed softly at their words. "If you make me a god," he told them, "you deny what I have taught. For what I have realized, all beings can realize. I am awake, and so can you be. But men crave idols. They wanted miracles, not mindfulness. They wanted to be saved, not awakened." The Buddha saw this, and his compassion grew even deeper. The fire within the Sangha. His growing fame brought with it a poison subtler than hate, pride among his followers. Some monks began to compete for closeness to him. They spoke of seniority, authority, purity, words that had no place on the path. One night, as they argued under the trees, the Buddha walked among them in silence. He sat down before them, his bowl empty, his robe dusty from the road. "Once there was a farmer," he said quietly, "who planted a seed. The plant grew tall, but its own leaves cast a shadow over the soil, and nothing else could grow. The farmer loved the plant so much that he watered only it, until one day it died, and the field lay barren. The plant was pride. The field was the heart. The seed of pride must die for compassion to grow." The monks lowered their eyes, ashamed. The Buddha smiled, not with scorn but with forgiveness. He knew that even the purest truth, once spoken, becomes tangled in the human heart. The return of Devadatta. Among those hearts was one especially troubled, Devadatta, the Buddha's cousin and once a devoted monk. Brilliant and eloquent, Devadatta's pride grew as his popularity among new followers rose. He began to believe that the Buddha had grown too gentle, too tolerant. He wanted a stricter order, ruled by discipline and fear. He wanted power. Whispers turned to rumors. Rumors turned to defiance. One day, Devadatta stood before the Buddha and declared, "You have grown old, revered one. Step aside. Let me lead the Sangha." The Buddha looked at him with eyes that held both sorrow and love. "You seek to lead others before you have mastered yourself." Devadatta's face hardened. He bowed, but it was not out of respect. From that day he became the Buddha's rival. He tried to turn the monks against him, spreading lies, promising power. When persuasion failed, he sent assassins. But when they came face to face with the Buddha, his calm shattered their rage. They fell to their knees, unable to harm him. Even as Devadatta's hatred deepened, the Buddha spoke of him only with compassion. "He, too, is on the path," he said, "though he walks it blind." The poisoned gift. In his obsession, Devadatta plotted again. He released a wild elephant into the street as the Buddha was walking with his disciples. The beast charged, its trumpeting shaking the earth. The monks scattered in terror, but the Buddha stood unmoved. As the elephant approached, he raised his hand and whispered, "Peace, my friend." The animal stopped, its rage dissolved. It knelt before him, its trunk brushing his feet. The people cheered, calling it a miracle. The Buddha simply stroked the elephant's head and said, "The greatest victory is not over beasts, but over anger." When the story reached Devadatta, he grew ill with shame and envy. Soon after, his schemes consumed him, and his body failed. Even then, the Buddha sent disciples to care for him. "No one is beyond compassion," he said. The silence of the master years passed, and the Buddha's fame grew beyond any measure he desired. Kings bowed to him, queens sought his counsel, and merchants dedicated their fortunes to his teachings. And yet, he lived as always, walking, teaching, begging, meditating. One day, a young monk asked, "Master, why do you not rest? You have done so much." The Buddha smiled faintly. "Do you rest when you breathe?" Teaching, he knew, was not effort, but nature, like rain falling, like light shining. The flower sermon. Late one morning, the Buddha gathered his disciples on a mountain. They expected another discourse, words to guide, parables to inspire, but instead he said nothing. He simply picked up a lotus flower and held it before them. The monks waited, puzzled. Only one, Mahakashyapa, smiled. The Buddha returned his smile and said softly, "I have the true Dharma eye, the heart of understanding, and I give it to Mahakashyapa." That was all. No sermon, no scripture, no argument. Only a flower, a smile, and silence. In that moment, the Buddha revealed what no words could teach. that truth is not spoken but seen, not explained but lived. The weight of worship. But still, the world tried to turn his silence into scripture. His students began writing down his words, arguing over their meanings. Some built monasteries, others built myths, and wherever the Buddha went, people knelt before him. They begged him to perform miracles, to grant blessings. He said, "Do not pray to me. Pray for understanding. Do not look for heaven in the sky. It blooms in the heart that knows peace." Yet even as he spoke, he saw that few could truly listen. The Master's sorrow. One evening, under the same moon that had once shone over his palace, the Buddha sat alone. He thought of all the faces he had met, the poor, the kings, the monks, the mothers. He thought of how his simple truth had already begun to splinter into sects and rituals. He felt a flicker of sorrow, not for himself, but for the world. And then he smiled. "Even illusion serves the path," he whispered. "Every misunderstanding is a step toward understanding." He knew that the Dharma, once born, would walk its own way through time, sometimes lost, sometimes rediscovered, but never destroyed. The seed of awakening had been planted in the heart of humanity. Even if centuries buried it in dust, one day it would bloom again. The lesson of the flame. Before sleeping that night, the Buddha turned to his disciples and said, "Do not cling even to the teaching. My words are like a finger pointing to the moon. If you gaze at the finger, you miss the moon. When I am gone, follow not my name, but the truth I have shown." And then he added, "Remember, even this body will fade, but the flame I have lit will not." The disciples listened in silence. The fireflies moved through the forest like drifting stars. The wind carried his words across the trees, gentle, eternal. "The one who knows himself knows all worlds," he said softly before closing his eyes. And thus, even at the height of his fame, the Buddha remained what he had always been. Not a god, not a ruler, not a savior, but a man who had learned how to see. The years had passed like seasons through a forest, quietly, invisibly, inevitably. The Buddha was now an old man. His once strong frame had grown lean, his hair turned silver, his steps slower, but his presence remained as radiant as the dawn. He had spent 45 years walking the dusty roads of India, speaking to kings and peasants alike, showing the path to thousands. He had lived without possessions, slept under the stars, and eaten what strangers placed in his bowl. Now, as the sun began to sink upon his life, he knew his journey was nearing its end. But the Buddha did not fear death. He saw it as he saw everything else, a part of the great rhythm, a breath within the infinite. The quiet departure. In the kingdom of Magadha, the rains had ended. The air was cool, and the rivers were swollen with life. One morning, the Buddha told his attendant Ananda, his most devoted disciple, "Come, Ananda, let us go north. I wish to visit the people of Kusinara one last time." Ananda bowed, though his heart trembled. He had begun to see the signs, the Buddha's frailty, the slowing of his pace, the faintness of his voice. They set out on foot, the Buddha leaning lightly on a staff, surrounded by monks who followed at a respectful distance. As they walked through the villages, people came out of their homes to bow and weep. Some fell at his feet, others offered fruit and flowers. He smiled gently at each of them, saying, "Do not cling, my friends. The body is but a leaf. It falls when the time comes. The tree of truth does not die, the fading body." In Vesali, the Buddha fell ill, his stomach burned and his strength failed. Ananda wept, but the Buddha said, "Do not grieve. The body has done its work. It has carried the mind as far as it can. Even this pain is a teacher. Watch it, and it will pass." He rested beneath the shade of a tree, and when he opened his eyes again, the sky was full of migrating birds. He smiled. "Even now," he said, The world moves as it always has, life flowing into life. Nothing stops. Nothing ends. After several days of recovery, he rose and continued walking. The monks pleaded with him to rest, but he answered, "When the rain is over, should the river stop flowing?" The farewell to Ananda. As they traveled, the Buddha spoke often to Ananda. They walked side by side through the fields, their shadows long upon the earth. "Ananda," he said, "you have been my companion for many years. You have cared for me as a son cares for his father. But listen well, when I am gone, do not think the teaching ends. The truth does not depend on me. Be a lamp unto yourself. Let your own mind be your guide." Ananda lowered his head, his eyes wet. "But Master," he said softly, "how shall we live without you?" The Buddha touched his shoulder. "The same way you live now, in awareness. Do not look for me in the sky nor in the temples. Look in the quiet place where compassion lives. There you will find me." The last teaching. At Pava, a humble blacksmith named Kunda invited the Buddha and his monks to dine. He prepared a meal with reverence, offering mushrooms and rice. The Buddha ate gratefully, but soon after he felt pain again. He realized that his end was near. Yet even in his weakness, he thought only of the man who had fed him. He said to Ananda, "When I am gone, tell Kunda not to grieve." His offering was pure, his heart sincere. One meal nourished my awakening, another my departure. Both are blessed. That night, the Buddha asked to be taken to Kusinara, a quiet forest near the river Hiranyavati. He told his disciples, "There, between two sal trees, I will take my rest," the forest of stillness. They reached the grove at twilight. The forest was bathed in golden light, and the sal trees, though it was not their season, began to bloom, white petals falling like snow. Ananda spread a simple robe on the ground. The Buddha lay down upon it, his head resting on his right hand, his face turned to the west where the sun was setting. He looked around at the monks gathered in silence. Some wept openly, others sat with trembling hands. "Do not cry," he said softly. "All things that arise must pass away. This is the law. Even the most beautiful flower must fade, yet its fragrance remains." The final questions. Ananda knelt beside him. "Master, after you are gone, who shall lead us?" The Buddha's eyes, half closed, gleamed with peace. "The Dharma shall be your guide. The truth is your teacher. No man can own the path. It belongs to all who walk it." Another monk asked, "How shall we know we are following it rightly?" "When your heart is free of clinging," the Buddha answered, "and you see all beings as yourself, then you are on the path." A silence followed. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the scent of the blossoms. The great passing. The Buddha took a deep breath, his eyes opening once more. He gazed at the sky, at the gathering stars, at the faces of those who loved him. "All that is born will die," he said. "This is the way of all worlds. Work diligently for your own awakening." Then he closed his eyes. The monks waited, listening to the sound of his breath, slow, steady, fading. Then there was stillness. The sal blossoms fell in waves, covering his body in white. A great peace descended, vast and gentle, as if the whole universe had paused to bow. The awakened one had entered parinirvana, the final freedom beyond all birth and death. The silence. After the forest remained silent for a long time, even the birds did not sing. The monks sat motionless, the weight of their grief too deep for tears. Ananda, trembling, whispered, "He is gone." But an older monk said quietly, "No, brother, he is not gone. Look around. The trees bloom though it is not their season. The air itself carries his peace. He is everywhere the truth is seen." And so, even in death, the Buddha was teaching still. The cremation. The next day, they built a pyre of fragrant wood. They placed his body upon it with reverence. When the fire was lit, the smoke rose straight into the sky, as if carried by something unseen. From every kingdom, people came to collect his ashes, to honor the one who had taught them how to live and how to let go. His relics were divided among 8 kings and enshrined in stupas across the land, not as symbols of worship, but as reminders of impermanence. The flame that burned his body became the flame that lit countless hearts. The Buddha is not in the ashes, Ananda said years later. He is in the silence between our breaths. He is in the space where the mind rests without fear. Thus ended the journey of the man who had sought an end to sorrow and found the timeless peace beneath all things. The prince had become the pilgrim. The pilgrim had become the teacher. The teacher had become the silence that speaks in every heart that listens. The forest at Kusinara never forgot that night. Those who came later said that even the trees bowed, their blossoms raining down like tears upon the earth. The river nearby flowed in stillness, carrying the last light of the moon as if it feared to disturb the silence. The awakened one, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, had entered parinirvana, the final liberation beyond birth, death, and all illusion. Yet his passing was not an end. It was the moment when time itself seemed to open, revealing that what dies in form lives eternally in truth. The dawn after death. When dawn rose, the monks gathered around the still form of their teacher. His face, though lifeless, glowed with the same serenity that had filled it in life. There was no tension, no struggle, only peace. Ananda, who had been his shadow for 25 years, knelt beside him and whispered, "You taught us to let go, my master. Now we must learn to let go of you." The monks wept softly, but their grief was mingled with wonder. They remembered his last words. "All things that arise must pass away. Work diligently for your own awakening." Even now those words echoed in their hearts, both a farewell and a command, the great cremation. For 7 days, people from every corner of the land came to pay homage. Kings and farmers, rich and poor, monks and wanderers, all came to bow before the body of the man who had taught them that they too could awaken. When at last the pyre was lit, the air filled with the fragrance of sandalwood and flowers. The flames rose slowly, curling upward like golden wings. The monks chanted in unison, "All compounded things are impermanent. All things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence." When the fire had burned to ashes, the monks found that certain relics remained. Small, luminous fragments said to shimmer with a light that was not of this world. They divided them among 8 kingdoms, each building a stupa, a sacred mound, to enshrine their portion of the relics. Thus, from his passing, 1,000 centers of peace were born. The message spreads. In the years that followed, the Buddha's disciples spread across the land. They carried no weapons, no banners, no scriptures carved in stone. They carried only memory, the living echo of his words. They walked barefoot through jungles and deserts, across rivers and mountains, from the Bay of Bengal to the Himalayas. They taught in simple speech to all who would listen. Kings in their courts, merchants in their shops, children in the dust of the roads. And wherever they went, the world seemed to grow quieter. They built no temples at first, for they said, "The Buddha is not in wood or stone. He is in the heart that knows compassion." But in time, temples rose nonetheless, not out of ambition, but reverence. Monasteries grew, where monks copied his words by hand, preserving them in palm leaves and scrolls. In caves, in forests, in cities, the Sangha lived, meditating, teaching, planting the seeds of peace. The voice beyond time, generations passed. Empires rose and fell, but the Dharma, the teaching, continued like a river flowing beneath the surface of history. When the kings of India faded, monks carried it eastward, to Sri Lanka, to Burma, to China, to Tibet, and beyond. Each land shaped it in its own image. In China, it became a philosophy of harmony. In Japan, a discipline of mindfulness. In Tibet, a song of devotion and wisdom. But wherever it went, the essence remained unchanged. Do no harm, speak the truth, be mindful, let go. The man who had once wandered barefoot beneath the trees had now become a presence in every corner of the earth, not as a god, but as a mirror in which humanity could see itself clearly. The kingdom of the mind centuries later, scholars tried to measure his legacy. They counted temples, statues, followers, but the true measure was invisible, in every heart that learned to forgive, in every mind that learned to see. For the Buddha had not founded a religion. He had revealed a law of being, as constant as gravity and as infinite as compassion. He had shown that salvation was not elsewhere, not in heaven, not in the future, but here, now, in the simple act of seeing things as they are. The imperishable teaching time wore down empires, but his words endured. They were carved on stone pillars, painted on silk, whispered in monasteries high in the clouds. And yet the greatest temple ever built to him was not of marble or gold. It was the mind that understands. He had said, "By oneself is evil done, by oneself is one defiled, by oneself is evil left undone, by oneself is one purified." Purity and impurity depend on oneself. No one can purify another. Even in lands that never knew his name, his wisdom seeped through into philosophy, art, science, and silence. For truth, once spoken with purity, becomes the voice of all humanity. The dream of Ananda. One night, years after the Buddha's death, Ananda dreamed of his master. He saw him walking along the banks of the Ganges, the river glittering in the moonlight. "Master," Ananda said, "you are gone, and yet you remain. How can this be?" The Buddha turned to him smiling. "The moon does not die when clouds pass before it. The light remains, whether seen or hidden." Ananda awoke weeping, not from sorrow, but from joy. He understood at last that the Buddha had never left. The eternal Dharma centuries later, pilgrims would still travel to Lumbini, to Bodh Gaya, to Sarnath, to Kusinara, tracing the footsteps of the man who once walked barefoot in search of truth. They would bow, not to worship, but to remember that one man's awakening can become the light of countless lives. As the lamp lights another, the scriptures say, so the flame of wisdom passes from heart to heart, and the darkness of the world is lessened. The Buddha's body had vanished into ash and dust, but the flame of his insight, the compassion, the calm, the seeing, continued to burn in the silence of every generation. He had shown the world not how to escape suffering, but how to walk through it without fear. Not how to live forever, but how to live awake. And so, even as centuries turned to dust, the voice of the Buddha whispered through time, "All things pass, but the truth does not die." The Buddha had not sought to be remembered, and yet he had become memory itself, the still point in the turning world, the pause between breath and thought, the infinite peace behind every fleeting moment. He had given the world not a creed, but a way, not answers, but eyes, not salvation, but silence. And in that silence, the sound of awakening never ceased. Centuries turned to millennia. Empires fell into dust, oceans shifted their shores, languages were born and forgotten. But the voice of the Buddha never faded. It did not echo through war or conquest. It whispered instead through hearts that learned to be still, through minds that learned to see. He had taught no dogma, built no throne, crowned no successor. He had given the world something greater, a path that could be walked in silence, alone or together, beneath the same sun that had once shone upon him. The Dharma, The truth he revealed had become like the air, invisible yet sustaining all who breathed it. And though centuries had dressed it in many forms, it remained what it always was, the art of seeing clearly, the science of compassion, the way of awakening. The river that never ends. From the forests of India, the Dharma flowed outward like a great river. It carried the fragrance of peace to the mountains of Tibet, where monks chanted under the stars. It reached the ancient cities of China, where scholars wove its wisdom into poetry and philosophy. It crossed the seas to Japan, where the sound of bells at dawn and the raked sand of gardens became prayers without words. And everywhere it went, it adapted, not by losing its truth, but by wearing the language of those who needed it. In each land, the Buddha took a new form, a laughing sage, a meditating ascetic, a child, a flame, a flower. But beneath every image was the same light, the quiet certainty that suffering is not punishment, but teacher, that peace is not escape, but understanding. The Dharma did not spread through armies or edicts, but through the power of example, through the eyes of those who had found calm in the storm. The age of scholars and kings centuries after his passing, kings would bow before monks. They would carve his teachings into the sides of mountains, etch them into gold, preserve them in hidden libraries guarded by wind and prayer. In stone and ink, they tried to hold what could not be held, the breath of wisdom. Yet even as time erased their monuments, the essence endured, for truth does not belong to stone, it belongs to silence. There were scholars who tried to dissect his philosophy, to cage it in logic and language. They wrote volumes on the nature of emptiness, of being and non-being. They debated the meaning of nirvana, of mind, of self. But the Buddha had already answered long ago, words are nets. The truth is the ocean. To know the ocean, you must dive, not count the waves. And so, while empires argued over scriptures, the Dharma continued in the breath of a monk, meditating beneath a tree, in the kindness of a woman feeding a stranger, in the calm smile of a dying man who had made peace with impermanence. The hidden flame. Through centuries of darkness, wars, famines, ignorance, the flame of awakening never went out. Sometimes it flickered in small corners of the world, in caves or monasteries where a handful of seekers kept vigil through the ages. Sometimes it roared brightly in golden temples filled with chanting voices, but wherever it burned the same. In the Himalayan passes, monks carved mantras into stone. In the deserts of the Silk Road, merchants whispered the Buddha's name for good fortune. In the cities of the West, philosophers and scientists rediscovered his insight, that the mind shapes reality, that perception is the root of suffering and freedom alike. Even those who never called themselves Buddhist began to live by his wisdom. They learned mindfulness, compassion, awareness. They spoke of balance, of the present moment, of peace without possession. And though the centuries changed the world, they could not change the truth that he had found beneath the Bodhi tree. The Dharma in the modern world. Now, in the noise of modern cities, where the hum of machines drowns out silence, his voice is still there. Quiet, patient, eternal. It lives in the breath between thoughts, in the pause before anger, in the moment when someone chooses kindness over cruelty. People still search for what he sought, peace, meaning, freedom from fear. And his answer remains the same. Look within. If you cannot find peace within yourself, he had said, you will not find it anywhere. The temples of today may stand in steel and glass. The monks may wear headphones instead of robes, but the essence of the teaching is unchanged. Suffering is universal, but so is the capacity to awaken. The Buddha had never asked the world to believe. He had asked it to observe, and for every person who stops for even a moment to breathe, to see, to forgive, the Dharma lives anew. The circle returns. In the old texts it is written, "The Buddha is born in every age, in every heart that opens to truth." Perhaps that is why his story never ends. It repeats in every soul that grows weary of illusion and begins to seek. It is not a story of a man long dead, but of the timeless possibility that lives in all beings. When a child asks why people suffer, when a prisoner chooses forgiveness, when an old man closes his eyes in peace, there the Buddha lives again. He is not in the heavens, nor in statues of gold. He is in the single breath of awareness that turns darkness into light. The eternal teaching. It is said that, even now, if you sit beneath a tree at dawn and listen, truly listen, you will hear what he heard. Not words, but the sound of the world breathing, the whisper of impermanence, the rhythm of life unfolding and ending and unfolding again. And in that sound, you will understand what the Buddha understood, that nothing is lost, that everything is connected, that to awaken is simply to stop running from what already is. This world, he said, is a mirror. When the mind is still, the mirror shines. When the heart is open, all beings are reflected as one. The Buddha never left the earth. He simply dissolved into everything. The wind through the trees, the kindness between strangers, the quiet breath of those who meditate on love. The light that does not die now. Thousands of years after his passing, his image still sits beneath the Bodhi tree in the minds of millions. Eyes half closed, lips curved in peace, hands resting gently in the gesture of truth. But beyond that image, the real Buddha waits, not in temples or prayers, but in awareness itself. He waits in you, in every moment of patience, every act of compassion, every breath taken in gratitude. He waits for you to awaken as he once did, to the infinite simplicity of being alive. And when that awakening comes, not as thunder, but as dawn, you will smile, as he did, and see the world not as broken, but as whole. Thousands of candles, he said, can be lit from a single flame, and the life of that flame will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared. The Buddha's flame still burns, not in temples, but in hearts. Not in heaven, but in the world he loved enough to understand. And as long as even one being remembers how to see, how to breathe, how to love, the eternal Dharma will never die. Thus ends the enlightened path, the life of Buddha, the story of the man who found peace beneath the Bodhi tree and gave it to the world.